I'd like to ask you to come along with me and let me tell you a story. All the years I was growing up, my dad was a troubleshooter for General Motors. And I guess General Motors must have had a lot of trouble. Because we moved every year, and sometimes twice, coast to coast and back again. When I finished high school, I had been in 12 schools in 12 years. Now, if you ask me to describe all those homes and all those schools, I couldn't do it unless you ask me about the first grade. Santa Maria, California. You know, if I focus really hard, I can still almost smell those orange blossoms. They were just every place. I loved the first grade, you all. I loved the first grade. And what's more, I loved the seesaw. Now, I'm looking around this room wondering if there's anybody who remembers those thick wooden planks we used to call seesaws. Would you raise your hand? Oh, thank you. And if you were fibbing to make me feel better, it worked. It worked. Now, if you remember that, you remember this. When we got on, we had to be really careful because we wouldn't pick up a splinter. Yeah? And you had to hold on for dear life because we didn't have handles, did we? Those little 6-year-old hands just had to grasp that seesaw. Well, I had a little blonde-headed friend, and every day when the teacher called recess, she and I would make a dash for the only seesaw on that school ground. Oh, we had so much fun. You remember how when you got to go up in the air, you just felt like you could see forever? You felt like you were soaring? Well, one day, my little blonde-headed friend and I were seesawing away, and for no explicable reason, she decided to get off. Has that happened to some of you? Well, you know what happened. I went crashing to the ground. And as I sat there, feet firmly planted on the ground, totally in control, never letting anybody on the other end of that seesaw lest they let me down, that's what I've come to call a person who is a self-sufficient. You know, many years later, I saw a glimpse of that scene in my mind's eye, and I thought, oh, good heavens, that's the metaphor for the way I've been living my life all these years. Too self-sufficient, not being able to ask for help. And so what I'm going to bring to you today is what I've learned about that. Because I know that there's some of you in this room today sitting there with your feet on the ground, totally and completely in control. Maybe you consider yourself a self-sufficient. So I'm going to give you some clues about what that is, where it came from, what we can do about it, so that hopefully you'll walk out of the room with that little snippet I talked about. I want to share it with a story. I have a dear friend, her name is Sarah. I love Sarah. And when I used to live in Dallas, Texas, I guess you all can hear the Texas accent. When I lived in Dallas, a couple of times a month, Sarah would call me and say, Peggy, let's go to lunch, and would you drive? Even though I had been to the restaurant 100 times, Sarah would give me every minute detail to get me there. Now, it sounded something like this. Peggy, be really careful because that auto dealership is on the corner there and it's hard to see till you get right up on it, but that's where you're going to make your right turn. And it would be something like, it's a little hard to describe, but down here there's a Shell station and you're not going to turn left, you're going to go angled. And we'd finally get to the restaurant. And then when the waitress seated us, you all, I could time it about 3 minutes by my watch, and Sarah would say something like, I think we're too close to the kitchen. And she'd have the waitress come up and move us. And then as soon as we got seated and comfortable in the menus, and another 3 minutes, Sarah would say, you know, I think we're in the traffic pattern. And she'd get up and move us again. And you know, before we left that restaurant, we had burned up at least 80 calories. And we had seen the whole darn restaurant. I could have given a tour. When I first met Sarah and got to know her and realized that she was going to carry me through everything, I tried to reassure her that I knew where I was going when we went to a restaurant, but you know what happened? It wasn't any help. Sarah needed to do that. And after a while, I recognized that she needed to do that. And because I love Sarah, I've just gone along. When my daughter Sally was in the 2nd grade, I was working on the schools. My son was in the 9th grade, and I was fairly successful at work. I was pleased with the accomplishments, and so now I was working on the schools. I was chair of the school carnival for 2 years in a row. I was head of the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association. And so when they called me to drive a group of 2nd graders to a field trip at the Dr. Pepper plant, I was thrilled. So I pulled up and got there, and a whole bunch of 2nd graders, including my daughter Sally, jumped in the car, and off we went. And I want to tell you all, we were having the best time. We were just going along singing, row, row, row your boat. And all of a sudden, I looked in my rearview mirror, and there were swirling lights. Well, I pulled over. The policeman asked me for my driver's license and my registration. I stepped out of the car. And after he finished with those, he went back to his cruiser. And we all know what he was doing back there, right? He was checking to see if I'd stolen that car. And I want to ask you all a question. What person in their right mind would steal a car full of 2nd graders? That doesn't make sense, does it? Well, we continued to the Dr. Pepper plant, and as I pulled up, I could see the frantic mothers who were also driving, standing there looking to the right and left, wondering where I was. I opened the doors, all the 2nd graders jumped out screaming, "We almost got put in jail." Honest engine, you all, true story. I never got asked to drive again. And I thought to myself, oh, well, accomplishments come and go. You know, here's another one. Now, I see that there's some guys with us today, and I know, Jim, I know men well enough at least, that you all may be sitting there thinking, I wonder if this is a gender issue. Maybe this is just for women. And so for you guys, I want to remind you that it was a man who invented the GPS just so you all would never have to ask for directions.